Hi everyone, welcome to week 3 of Early Modern. For this week, we're going to be talking a lot about sort of the reception of Descartes' meditations. And in particular, we're going to be talking about a few authors who sort of problematize Descartes' dualism that we discussed in the last video. Now, just to say a little bit more about that, really the core of this debate concerns the results of Descartes' cogito argument. Descartes argues in the cogito that, I think, therefore I am, right? And so the idea is that I can't know anything, or at least the knowledge that I have about my body is knowledge about which I can be wrong, right? I can be wrong in my characterization of my body and how it works. And, obviously, like, there are many things about the brain, there are many things about the human body that medical science still at this point does not really fully or adequately understand, right? And so, in terms of the epistemic status of things that we know about the body, for Descartes, it's much less than the sort of knowledge that we have about the mind, right? I know that I'm thinking because I am the thing that's doing that, right? This is sort of the sort of central impetus behind the cogito argument is that it's an immediate form of self-awareness, right? And that self-awareness is as a minded thing. In other words, I'm the sort of thing that wills or judges or, comes to conclusions, that's amenable to reasons, right? And so on. And while the body, is governed by efficient causal relationships, right? Like you can do, an investigation into the nature of the body using the resources of physics, right? You can describe how sort of like muscles work by, contracting, right? And that gives like a purely physical explanation of the body. Now, Descartes' dualism is sort of the belief, or an entailment of that belief, is just that because the mind and the body are fundamentally different substances, that we have different methods of becoming aware of, right? The way that I learn about the body is I conduct medical experiments, right? And there's a very nasty history of that. But for the time being, Descartes was investigating that by, cutting up bodies, right? And seeing sort of like what they do and how they react to things and so on. So you conduct experiments, right? It's knowledge that you gain through experimentation, through the results of the senses, right? And so on. Whereas our knowledge of the mind cannot be investigated in that way, or at least that's Descartes' claim. And moreover, the mind is governed by normative, um, prescriptive rules. And what that means is just that, you know, like whenever I make a judgment about something like that, I can be right or wrong. I can have better or worse reasons for that sort of belief, right? And the conceptual toolkit that we use to evaluate ideas, that we use to evaluate our own inferences and our own actions, right? That toolkit is different than the sort of toolkit they use in physics, right? To investigate bodies and their relationships, right? I mean, just as one example that will come up a lot over the course of this semester, many people think that the mind is free, right? The mind can sort of elect to make decisions. I'm deciding what I want to say right now, right? And that seems to be a crucial part, at least for many philosophers, of how we think about the human mind, right? And how we think about each other as agents, right? We're not just atoms in a void, right? We're not simply, we make normative judgments and evaluations of one another, right? And so this is sort of the minded component of our awareness. In the sixth meditation, Descartes says something to the effect of the body senses, but the mind understands, right? And basically, what Descartes is intending through the statement is to say that, the sensation sort of gives you like the raw data, right? That the mind sort of works with, at least whenever it's considering, things that it sees, things or feels, or so on, right? So the body, it simply transmits information or data, right? We might say. Whereas the mind is engaged in sort of evaluating that data, understanding like, oh, well, do I see things this way because I'm subject to an optical illusion? Do I see things this way because of certain, anthropological facts about my body? Do I see things this way because of certain psychological features about human beings, right? And so the body is governed by efficient causal relationships, right? Think about like, a billiard ball hitting another billiard ball, right? And moving it. That's the sort of interaction that bodies have with other bodies. And bodies are defined by Descartes through their extension. Bodies are things that take up space, right? That's the essential nature of what it means to be a body. And this is ultimately why we can engage in physical, examinations, right? Is because we can see how two bodies that take up space come to affect one another, right? And systematically begin to describe the nature of those sorts of relationships. Whereas for Descartes, the mind and how the mind operates, that's not something that you could come to discover through the toolkit or the concepts that are used for bodies that are extended, right? The difference between the mind and the body and the meditations is revealed through the fact that we can think about them as separable, right? Like I can be like maybe I'm a robot or maybe I exist in the Matrix or something like that, right? It's possible for me to doubt facts about my body. And it's possible, and indeed I am, in fact, mistaken about various things about my body, right? But I cannot be mistaken about that immediate kind of self-awareness that's critical to what it means to be a minded thing, to be a thinking thing, as Descartes says. And this is why Descartes says that there are two fundamentally different kinds of substances, right? There's the kind of substance that's a thinking thing or a mind, and there's the kind of substance that is an extended thing or a body, right? They have different means of, us coming to know them. They have different epistemic statuses, right? They have different methods of investigation, right? And so on. And so for Descartes, this is sort of one of the crucial sort of starting points of his investigation is that we need an account of the fundamental nature, the essence of things that exist for us, right? And Descartes thinks that many of the errors that we run into are a result of, either applying the sort of framework that's appropriate to minds, to bodies, or applying the sort of framework that's appropriate to bodies and applying them to minds, right? This is the source of a number of mistakes, is that we've confused the essential nature of two completely different kinds of substances that are, importantly, very distinct in terms of how we know them and all of that, right? Now, this introduces a sort of problem, right? A problem that is sort of brought up in the sixth meditation, but definitely, I would say, not resolved. And that problem is that, whenever we are not in sort of the skeptical mode of the first meditation, whenever we're not concerned about, are we dreaming? What are the things that we can know about ourselves for certain, right? When we're not thinking in that register, we normally think about human beings as having both a body and a mind, right? Like this body is mine, right? And I am Penelope, right? And maybe the kind of way that I know my body and the way that I know my mind are importantly distinct. Nonetheless, in everyday circumstances, I definitely think of myself not only as, a mind, but also an embodied mind, right? And so this introduces a little bit of a puzzle because then the question becomes, if the mind and the body are two fundamentally different kinds of substances, how is it that we can come to think about the mind and the body interacting with one another, right? How can I be both an embodied being and a minded being? Right? If there are two different kinds of substances, right, how do they interact? How do they exist in the world together if they're fundamentally distinct, right? And one important dimension of this is that bodies take up space and are engaged in efficient causal relationships. They bump and move each other around, right? Whereas for Descartes, minds are not extended, right? And whenever I'm engaged in pure thinking, I'm not concerned with things that exist in space, right? So, just as an example, the proposition 2 plus 2 equals 4 does not exist in a determinate location in space, right? It's a rational fact, and as a rational fact, holds in all spaces, right? This is Descartes' idea. This is how Descartes builds his own philosophical system and sort of begins the emergence of modern philosophy in the Meditations. And this problem about the mind and the body, which, we can use various different sort of terms to refer to. We can talk about mind-body dualism, right? Which is say there are two different kinds of substances, minds and bodies, right? And then we can also talk about interactionism, which is the belief that the mind and the body causally interact with one another, right? Whenever we say that we're free, what we mean is that the mind causes the body to behave in a certain way, right? So how is it possible that I think I want to say something and then my body starts doing stuff. My brain sends electrical signals to, my mouth, and stuff comes out, right? And so the question is like, how does that happen, right? What is the relationship ultimately between the mind and the brain? And important for us, those are going to be distinct, right? The brain is a physical system, right? It's an organ that we have, right? And so in Descartes' schema, the brain is a particularly sophisticated kind of body, right? Whereas the mind is something that's not embodied, right? And so in addition to talking about the mind body relation, we can equally formulate that as the mind-brain interaction. What is the relationship between the mind and the brain? And this is still fundamentally the same problem that we are still talking about 400 years later in philosophy of mind. It's just, what is the relationship between the mind and the brain? Now, there are a lot more people than Descartes nowadays who believe that the mind and the brain are more closely related than Descartes says. Some people even think that the mind just is the brain, right? But to really understand the significance of this sort of position, we need to understand, why is it that someone would say that the mind is not the brain, right? Why is it that we have this sort of Cartesian perspective in general, right? And ultimately, for Descartes, this comes from the cogito. And it comes from the fact that we can think about the mind and we can think about the body as being separate substances. And this is revealed culturally, this sort of Cartesian perspective, in that we often imagine like sort of body swap situations, right? Like I think the movie is like 13 going on 30 or something like that. Is that right? Where the sort of plot device of the movie is that two women switch bodies, right? Now, how is it that they can switch bodies without switching minds, right? Like, what is the relationship between the mind and the fact that they're in a totally new body, and like, what does that do to the brain, so on, right? Obviously, this is a fictional case, and so it's not going to exactly track. But what this sort of fictional case shows is that the typical way that we think about our minds is that we think about them as at least potentially separable from our body, right? This is also revealed through sort of the desire to like upload your brain into a computer or something like that, right? The idea is the embodiment of our mind is somehow not essential to the nature of the mind itself, right? Okay, so this is the problem space that we're dealing with, and we're going to talk about three different texts that sort of talk about this issue of philosophy of mind. You only actually had to read two of them, but I want to give you a more sophisticated picture of what Descartes' doing because a lot of people don't really have very much respect for Descartes. And what I mean by that is that typically people sort of refer to Cartesianism as a sort of problem, right? There are not a lot of people that would nowadays sort of describe themselves as Cartesian, right? So, I want us to get as um, rigorous a picture of Descartes' idea of embodiment as we can so that we can be more precise in the exact nature of the problem, right? What is the problem, ultimately? Okay, so I've divided this up into three sections. The first section is Princess Elizabeth, right? And you had to read her correspondence with Descartes. This came in 1643, so 2 years after the publication of the Meditations. And I will also say that Princess Elizabeth is widely regarded as providing the most fundamental objection to Descartes in the entire Western philosophical tradition, right? And she did it only 2 years after the original publication of the Meditations in 1641. So, it is really impressive. It's really impressive because if Descartes' position sort of to us now resonates or sounds like it states a problem, right? Elizabeth is the one who really articulates this problem in its full scope and brings it to the attention of Descartes himself, right? And Descartes, to his credit, did not simply dismiss Elizabeth's concerns as unimportant or, something to that effect, but he actually took them pretty seriously. He ended up writing, and this is our second section. We're going to talk about another Descartes book, which I didn't assign because I didn't want to overload you with too much reading. But you can do it for extra credit, like maybe the first chapter or something like that. This is a book titled The Passions of the Soul. And it's a book that Descartes wrote that sort of addresses a number of different topics. But one of them is how the mind and the body come to interact or relate to one another, right? And specifically, excuse me, at this point, Descartes is thinking about especially emotions, right? Which he'll call passions, right? Which for him sort of show ways in which your mind is affected by what happens with your body. You feel pleasure, you feel pain, right? Based on things that happen to the body. And that's something that happens in the mind, right? And so, in a lot of ways, as we'll see in more detail in just a moment, The Passions of the Soul is a book length reply to this objection that Princess Elizabeth poses to Descartes. And she does it in more than one letter. And she's, in some ways, quite dogged in her insistence on this as a problem, right? And so Descartes ends up writing an entire book about the problem that Elizabeth brings up and dedicates the work to her. He seems to like clearly value her as a thinker, right? Which I think is pretty cool. And, obviously not common for 17th century men to take the opinions of women very seriously, right? And to think about, for Descartes thought about Princess Elizabeth as a genuine philosophical thinker, right? And that is pretty astounding, right? And for a long time, Princess Elizabeth sort of like was not part of the canon. Like you would not typically read this correspondence in early modern philosophy course. And part of the reason why is because she never like published her own book or monograph or something like that, right? But there's been efforts more recently to sort of expand our notion of the canon. And one of the things that we found is, wow, we're missing out on this entire dimension of Descartes' philosophy because we've constructed this canon to only include men, right? So, it's my belief that by carefully considering the sort of objection that Elizabeth poses to Descartes, you not only get important political stuff about, diversifying the canon or whatever, but more fundamentally than that, you get access to what the real problems are in the tradition, right? The motivation is not a political one, or at least it doesn't have to be. It can also just be that you want to get things right. And to get things right in talking about early modern philosophy, even though other early modern philosophers other than Descartes didn't really know that much about Elizabeth and that sort of thing. Another philosopher that we'll discuss, Leibniz, also had a correspondence with Elizabeth. Um, she nonetheless played an absolutely essential role in the development of early modern philosophy because Descartes only wrote this book in response to Elizabeth. And as we'll see in the more sort of like standard canonical figures in the tradition, such as Spinoza and Leibniz, they end up ultimately recapitulating a lot of the objections that Princess Elizabeth made to Descartes, right? And even if they aren't responding to Princess Elizabeth directly, they did read The Passions of the Soul, right? Which is entirely motivated by the questions that Princess Elizabeth posed to Descartes. Okay, then finally, we're also going to talk about a very interesting figure in the early modern tradition, Anton Wilhelm Amo. In the text that we just read a very short excerpt of, only a few pages, is called On the Apathy of the Human Mind. And here, apathy refers to the ability of the mind to be affected, right? Like you might think about apathy as like you're not doing anything, right? Specifically, what Amo is concerned with is how you can be impacted, right? Like by other things, by the external world. We'll talk about that more in depth in a moment. Let's begin with Elizabeth. In many ways, Elizabeth states the problem to Descartes in a single sentence. She asks, I ask you to tell me how the soul of a man can determine the bodily spirits to make voluntary actions. Okay, so let's start out with a few of these terms. So first of all, just to get it out of the way, bodily spirits, what is Elizabeth talking about? Okay, so in the 17th century, right, talking a long time ago, their understanding of how the body functioned is that they imagined that the brain would send out like what they called them animal spirits through the blood. So the idea was, the brain needs to communicate something or perform some sort of function, right? And then it makes certain parts of your body move or do something by sending animal spirits, right? But really, this language doesn't matter, right? Why does it not matter? Because we can just replace the idea of bodily spirits with electrical signals, right? Your brain sends electrical signals through the blood to various parts of the body, right? And in that way, even though obviously their understanding of the brain was imperfect, they nonetheless are like getting pretty close to our own model of what this looks like. Now, so when Elizabeth refers to the soul, we can think of that as something that is interchangeable with the mind, right? It's something that persists through the death of the body, right? Because bodies are extended, right, in space, they can always be divided. They can be cut up, right? And in that way, the unity of a body can always be destroyed, right? Like another body can come and crush, right, the existing body, right? Whereas the soul is seen as something that persists through these sort of modifications of a body, right? And so we can kind of see how these problems in philosophy of mind are also related to ethical and political problems in a religious tradition, right? Where oftentimes in these sort of traditions, they would have arguments to the effect that, hey, your motivation to act morally is that there's going to be a lawgiver who will judge the actions of your life whenever you die, right? But if there isn't a soul that exists apart from the body, then there's no way that that happens, right? So this idea of the soul is like extremely important to the Judeo-Christian tradition. And it gets really caught up with this problem in philosophy of mind. Okay, and then last word we're going to talk about before we talk about the sense as a whole is voluntary actions. And so what Elizabeth has in mind here, is chiefly like human freedom. Like, right? So the mind thinks, I will raise up 5 fingers, right? And then the body does it, right? And so the Elizabeth's question here is, how does the soul of a man determine the body to make voluntary actions? In other words, how is there an interaction between the mind and the body, right? And in many ways, like a philosopher who, one of your extra credit assignments you can read, Jae-Kwon Kim, he argues that this is the first materialist critique of Cartesian dualism. Now, why is it materialist? Well, because Elizabeth says it's easier for me to conceive of the mind as a material thing that then interacts with other material things, right? So if the mind just is the brain, right, then I can understand, oh, the brain does send electrical signals, to various parts of the body, and that is what causes voluntary action and so on, right? But if the soul or the mind is something that's not in space at all, right? How is it related to a particular body? How does a soul, how does this thing that seems to stand outside of the realm of physics come to dictate the behavior of bodies? That seems like it is within the domain of physics, right? And this is going to be a problem that we talk about basically for the rest of the semester. And so this is sort of how Elizabeth poses the question of Descartes. It's like, how is it that what happens in my body can ever affect what happens in my mind and vice versa, right? How is it that things that happen in my body, or, to my body, right, then have effects on my mind? Like, how is it that, I put my hand over fire and I feel pain, right? Clearly, what that shows is that there's an essential relationship between the mind and the body, right? And specifically, Descartes' conception of this relationship makes it very difficult to understand how such an interaction could ever occur. How could something outside of space cause something in space, right? Especially because we think about bodies as engaged in efficient causal interactions, right? If a billiard ball hits another billiard ball at a certain determinate speed and angle, right? We can then reliably predict like where the other billiard ball is going to go, right? And part of understanding physics as a physical system, right? You can't just introduce like other non-physical forces in, right? The idea of giving a physical account of bodies is that they're not supposed to be moved by other stuff, right? And so that's the general idea behind Elizabeth's critique of Descartes, is that she argues that if it is really true that the mind and the body are fundamentally different substances that have different essences, that their interaction must be inconceivable, right? Okay. Now, Descartes' response to this is to say, well, you're right. I didn't fully or adequately address this in the meditations, especially the 6 meditations, where I sort of raised the problem, but I don't really answer it. So, he compliments her. It's like, hey, you did a great job. You figured it out. This is the problem with my philosophical system so far. I need to do more. And then Descartes says something to the effect, too, of like, well, you say that for physical objects to interact, to have an effect on one another, they have to have contact with one another. But that's not strictly speaking true whenever you think about forces like gravity. And even though we don't fully understand how gravity functions, right, we do see that there's sort of like action at a distance to some extent. At least that's what Descartes says. And that in the same way that we don't fully understand gravitational force, we don't fully understand the causal interaction between the mind and the brain, right? And to some extent, that's okay as far as it goes, but it doesn't go that far, right? Why doesn't it go that far? Well, because Descartes, in some ways, is saying we don't understand how mind-body interaction works in the same way that we don't understand how gravitational forces work, right? And obviously, this is dissatisfying for us because we know a lot more now about how gravitational forces work, but that does not help us understand mind-body interaction. I think that Descartes sort of had a sense like, yeah, this probably isn't really good enough. And that's why he wrote The Passions of the Soul. He was also really concerned with like helping Elizabeth sort of come out of a depression, right? And for him, like this sort of philosophical enterprise showing like how the body can come to affect the mind is also to sort of begin to give an account of like how we can live a life where we're unaffected by the things that happen to us, right? Or at least less affected, less dramatically affected at an emotional level. And so, like, Elizabeth and Descartes, like, read Seneca together and read a bunch of, like, Stoic philosophy. And that's sort of the general vibe of Descartes' approach. So in The Passions of the Soul, Descartes tries to, in more depth, describe mind-brain interaction, right? And I know that this is very imperfect as a drawing, but this is my attempt at drawing a brain, right? And so what Descartes envisions, both in the case of sensation, where the mind comes to be affected by the body, but also in the case of voluntary actions, where the mind you know, causes the body to move in a certain way. What he envisions is that the brain sends out little animal spirits dispersed through the blood. And like I mentioned, we can think of these as just electrical signals, right? In our sort of updated scientific framework, right? And so the brain, through as a complex physical system, is able to send out animal spirits and also intake animal spirits from the body, and that's what produces certain sorts of sensations or certain kinds of bodily movement, right? Descartes envisioned that, like, you send electrical signals through your brain, it shows through your arm, and that makes your muscles contract, and that's what happens in voluntary actions, right? That's pretty good, right? That's pretty good as a scientific picture. It's like kind of close to what I think a lot of us would say happens now, right? Maybe you don't say animal spirit, but you definitely do have this picture of the brain and the brain working this way. And Descartes also says this little red part, the black here says mind-brain interaction. Through the brain, and these little blue dots are supposed to be animal spirits exiting from the brain towards, whatever part of the body that they're going to, right? Or coming from. And Descartes imagines that there's a little pea-sized part of the brain that actually does exist, the pineal gland, and that this is where the soul is attached to the body, right? And a lot of people sort of make fun of this idea, right? I think, um, I don't know. I think that people think that this idea is kind of funny because it's like, it doesn't really solve the problem, right? Because then it just raises the further question of like, well, how is it that the soul or the mind can be in the pineal gland? Why is it there instead of somewhere else, right? And these are two different questions, right? Um, how is the mind there, and why the pineal gland? And I think that Descartes has a good answer to the second one. Why the pineal gland? Well, the pineal gland is a part of the brain that's not mirrored, right? And so, we have two eyes, we have two hands, in typical cases where you're not injured, something to that effect, right? Various aspects of the human body are mirrored. But you only have one mind. You only have one soul. This is very important that your soul cannot be divided in the same way that your mind can, because if your soul could be divided, then you could die, right? And die in a way that is more permanent than simply bodily death. That would be the death of your soul, right? You get no afterlife or anything like that. So Descartes says, okay, well, the mind is in the pineal gland because the pineal gland is the only part of the brain. It's at the center of the brain and it's not mirrored, right? There's only one, right? And so this is why Descartes thought that this part of the brain had like chief executive function over the rest of the whole body, right? And like I mentioned, he engaged in a lot of dissections, right, of animals and so on in order to try to build like a good physical theory of how this works, right? Descartes was a scientist. He was a brilliant scientist, one of the most important scientists that we have in world history. Um, and this is part of him trying to develop this scientific image, right? That dualism is supposed to be a part of. But if he did answer the question, why the pineal gland? He did not really answer the question of how is the mind there, right? If the mind is supposed to be something that doesn't take up space, how does it come to have an essential relationship with this particular, part of the brain, right? How does it directly control that, right? Just locating the pineal gland doesn't really solve the problem, right? And it especially doesn't solve the problem now that we have more complex scientific image of how the brain works because we don't think about executive function as being in the pineal gland, right? Nonetheless, I think that, we can applaud Descartes for attempting to answer this problem and giving somewhat of a satisfying answer, answering some questions, right? Giving kind of a plausible scientific picture, but still not answering the core problematic, which is how is it that the mind and the brain can interact with one another? How is it that there is a seat of the soul, right, in the pineal gland or anywhere else? Descartes did not really have the resources to answer this sort of problem. And the closest he gets is saying something to the effect of, oh, well, God ties, a soul to a body, right? Something to that effect, right? That's not very satisfying, right? And this is going to be a sort of common theme in this class, is that when there's a sort of philosophical problem and authors don't know what to do, then oftentimes it's God that ends up saving the day, right? Um, but that's dissatisfying because that's just another way of saying that we don't know, right? We do know that we are, in fact, embodied, but we do not know from Descartes' picture how that is possible. Okay, so now briefly to talk about Anton Wilhelm Amo. I'm going to talk about this a little bit less just because we only read a few pages, right? That's all that's included in our textbook. So, this is sometime later, like nearly a century later, right? But this sort of discussion of Descartes' philosophy of mind is still running rampant, right? And What Amo has to say is very interesting because Amo focuses on sensation. Also worth mentioning, Amo is the only Black author that we will read in this course. And why is that the case? Well, because European society at this period is extraordinarily racist, right? And this is revealed in Amo's very situation. Amo was um, kidnapped into slavery as a child, I believe, from Ghana. And while, his brother and other members of his family were simply sold into slavery, he was given to a duke, right? And the idea is that he would be cultivated as a kind of enlightenment experiment, right? To see if, the Black mind or whatever could really reach the heights of philosophical inquiry, right? Profoundly racist. Profoundly racist. And there's no way that we can think about like the Duke that Amo was given to as a good person, right? We're describing basically Amo's enslavement, right? And even though like he was able to live perhaps a more satisfying life than others, we should still be pretty resolute about the legacy of slavery, right? Um, yeah. So he's originally from Ghana, and he was actually a professor at the University of Jena, which perhaps more advanced students know comes to play an extremely important role in the history of philosophy after Kant. So it's pretty impressive. It's very interesting that he was given this position and that he produced works that are pretty astounding, contributions to this kind of discussion. And so I know that there's a little bit of a glare, but I'll read this. What Amo has to say is that human beings sense material things not through the mind, but through a living and organic body, right? And so what Amo is trying to say here is that Descartes' picture that he gave in the sixth meditation, where it's the body that senses and the mind that understands, right? Amo is saying that there must be some sort of process already at the level of the body to sort of like um, begin to parse out the information that you're given, right? And another way that he puts this below here is to receive sensible species is to sense. And this suits an organ, and consequently a body. For organs do not suit the mind, but a body, right? And so what Amo is saying is that whenever you sense something, the processing happens at the level of the body, right? Not the level of the mind. You might say that the mind is sort of like given something already produced, an image or a representation that's already produced by the body. Our ability to see things is conditioned by our eyes. Our ability to hear things is conditioned by our ears, right? Smell, taste, touch, so on, right? All of those are related to physical systems in the body, right? And so the representations, the pictures of reality that they produce are themselves ultimately organic and bodily, right? Not simply minded. And if we can't think about sensation as something that happens in the mind, then we have to think about the body as something that can process information, right? And that's something that Descartes said was only possible by the mind. Okay, I want to stop here, even though there's a lot more to say, because I want to try to get things down to around that 40-minute mark. We're already a little bit over time, not too bad. But I hope that this has been helpful for y'all. I look forward to reading your discussion responses, and we're going to continue sort of investigating Descartes and Descartes' understanding of the world in next class, where we're going to talk about sort of Spinoza and Spinoza's critique of Descartes, and we're going to continue reading Descartes texts. I look forward to talking with you all. I hope you're having a good week. Bye.